demos today. So what I have set up is I have this, I actually use this for my DDev class. It's called my DDev demo site, but it's basically just a bunch of desserts. So we can all get hungry while we do this with some, I forget the theme, but some off the shelf Drupal contributed theme. So I have it running on my local, and I also have the same site running up on Pantheon. And of course, it's not going to run because it's been sleeping for a few minutes. I'll just wake that up. But both sites are up to date. Drupal 8.9. Whatever, it's 11. I think it's out right now. Code base is the same. Database is the same. Everything's synced. You know, if we come here, we do a git status. I actually have two. Origin is actually my GitHub repository. I'm actually pushing to multiple repositories, so I'm also pushing to the Pantheon repository. So let's just do some simple examples. These are things I probably would have liked to have done at the end of last class, but we kind of ran out of time. So let's just start with how the configuration system how you can get in trouble. Let's say that. And as usual, if you have questions, interrupt me, or let me open up the chat right now. If I got to find the chat. There it is. Okay. More chat. Okay, I got the chat window where I can see it now. So if you have a question, just throw it in there or interrupt me. Not that bigger. Okay. So as of right now, on the dev site, we'll call it the remote site, which is the Pantheon site. Oops, I don't want to go to split just yet. And on the local site, the config is clean on both, right? And if you remember from last time we talked, what does that basically mean? That the configuration in the file in the of the YAML files exactly matches the configuration in the database on local, and the configuration on Pantheon servers in the YAML files exactly matches what's in the database. So if we come over here to the Pantheon site and we make a change, and actually here, let's do something that could be considerably like a bigger change. You know, let's do, since we're talking about it, TV show. All right, so we're going to create a new TV show content type, and I'll just add one field, but you can imagine we could add, you know, a ton of fields. Oops. Select a field type. Let's do a list text and provider. And we can do like Hulu, if I can spell right, Netflix, Disney Plus, HBO, you know, NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox. All right, so we'll save all those. So you can imagine I could spend, you know, up on this dev site, I could spend all kinds of time basically creating this new content type. And every change I just made there, there's our provider right there. Every change we just made there is a configuration change. So every change I just made is resulting in configuration in this database right here. So if we go back over to our config sync page, you're going to see there's all kinds of things. And if we were to import all of these would be removed. And that's basically all of our TV stuff would be removed. All right, so let's pretend that someone who didn't really understand the configuration system actually just went ahead and did that, right? They just went ahead onto the dev site and said, oh, well, I'm tasked with creating a new content type. I don't feel like spinning up a local, so I'm just going to do it here on dev. Meanwhile, there's another developer who is, you know, who's been tasked with, you know, something very simple, but they're going to do things the right way. You know, they basically just need to add a slogan to the site. You know, I love cupcakes. All right, so there's a config change on our local. So again, there's no TV content type on local because that's only on dev. And dev doesn't have the new slogan yet because that's only on local. And both sites have some config changes. And this is very common where this is how you get in trouble with the configuration system, right? When you have configuration changes at multiple places and you don't have a process. You need a process for capturing those things. So let's do it the wrong way first. All right, the wrong way is, well, the cardinal sin's already been made, is making these configuration changes on dev and then walking away. That's the problem. Meanwhile, other developer on local is doing the right thing. I've changed some configuration. So let me export that configuration. Config export. And this is what we did last week. So this is more of just a review of this step. And yep, we want to export system.site. If we do a get status, we see we have just one file change. If we just look at that change, sure enough, before there was no slogan, the change adds a slogan. That's kind of what we expect. So let's do a get add config, get status again, this time spelled right. Get commit -m, added slogan, done. All right, so we did all that on local. So from a diagram standpoint, when I changed the slogan in Drupal's UI and hit submit, it saved it here. When I did my drush config export, the slogan is now here. When I did a get commit, get add and get commit, the slogan is now here. Right? Everybody with me so far? All right, so now let's push it. Git push Pantheon master. With this, I am now pushing that slogan up to here. So that's going onto Pantheon server. And because it's a dev environment, Pantheon is automatically going to pull that change into here. So we'll give it a second to do that. It's doing it there. Those of you who don't use Pantheon, whenever you push to the master branch, and you push the master branch to the Pantheon repo, Pantheon does an implicit pull of the master branch into the dev environment. So you don't have to manually do the pull. So that's what it's doing right now. If we go on our local, this is a bit bigger. Because we've done the config export, the slogan is now here and here. So the config should exactly match at this moment in time. So if we reload this page, we should be clean again on local. And now that this is done, right, our slogan is, was here. It just got pulled into here, but we haven't run this yet. So there's no slogan here, which means that this config differs from this config at the present moment. So let's confirm that. So if you go to the synchronized page up on the Pantheon site, here's all the TV stuff, but here is our change. Remember, if we view differences, in your head, translate, this is database, this is files, this is YAML. The database does not have that slogan, the files do. We can confirm that. No slogan yet. So how do we get, well, let's look at it over here. How do we get this configuration into here? Well, we do a config import. Now here is sin number 2. Sin number 2 is the developer who was doing the right thing, changing config on local, committing, pushing. Let's say they don't come here and check. They don't come here and look at this page. They're just, You know, they feel like they're doing the right thing. I've committed, I've pushed, I know it's here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use terminus here, remote drush. And I'm going to do, this is ddev demo.dev. This is like a drush alias for those of you who don't use terminus. Config import. All right, so I'm basically going to run config import on ddev demo. So bad things are going to happen. If we had taken the time to look at this, sure, we're going to basically move this from YAML files into database, and that's going to work. But if we click import all of these are going to be removed because all of this configuration lives here, but it's not here. And remember, the Drupal 8 configuration system's all or nothing. So when we do a config import, it throws away all of this config and it completely replaces it with all the config in here. So if we're not careful, like we're doing right now, we're basically throwing away all the config in our, in the database and replacing it with what's in the YAML files. And we're about to lose, and at this point, hopefully you would hope that the developer is savvy enough to go, oh, that does not look good. All these deletes, but maybe they're not, maybe here, something that's very common is that, I do it all the time. DDA drush en-y enable, right? Drush cex-y. And I don't have time to confirm. If you do this, we're done. We're hosed. We're going to lose our TV show. There it goes. Poof, it's gone. If we come back over here, things look great because we're going to be clean over here. And we should be clean because we just copied all of this over to here. So the result of a complete, a copy of everything is things are going to be synchronized. And if we come here, the change I made is fantastic. Here's my slogan. Well, the problem is I no longer have a TV show content type. So if someone else spent 3 hours creating that TV show content type, it's gone. So what do we learn from that? We basically learned, number one, everybody has to be on board with the config system. If you have 3 developers and only 1 developer is using the config system, you're going to have a bad time. So using configuration is more about process than technical ability. You have to enforce a process. It's okay if someone wants to do something, build out a content type on dev, but there has to be a process for when they're done, we have to export that config into the repo. All config has to get into the repo. Otherwise, you risk, happening what just happened. The other thing is anytime, so config exports are by their very nature fairly safe, right? Because you're taking active config, from a database, it doesn't really matter which database, you're taking active config and you're exporting it into files. So assuming you're using Git, even if you make that commit, you always have an escape patch, right? You can always git revert, you can always get back to where you were. Config import, not so much, unless you're doing a lot of database backups. Right? Because when you do a config import, if there's stuff in here, config that doesn't exist anywhere else in the repository, it's gone. And if you're doing that on production, backing up, or restoring production from an old backup, that's problematic for most sites, depending on the type of site you have. Because you're bound to lose your user-generated content, new user accounts, blah, 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 blah. So as any developer, on a team, before you do a config import, at the very least, you should be checking this page. make sure that the only changes you see here are yours. Because if there's other changes there, there's something happening that you're not aware of, then things could go south. I never, when I do a config import, I never do -y. Ever, 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 ever. I'm so anal retentive about stuff like this. Just to make sure I never screw up, I don't do a -y for config export either. Just so when I'm typing drush config whatever, I want to have to, confirm. So, as I like to say, I always think I should have a slide for it, but I never put a slide for it. But it's like my saying when I teach config system, the first rule of the config system is to talk about the config system, right? You have to define that process. Have to. And the config read-only module, which I think I'm going to cover first because it kind of, it naturally flows from where we are. The config read-only module actually helps you enforce process if you want to use it. Because you could have a process that basically says, no one's allowed to make changes anywhere but local, right? And, it doesn't, you don't have to, that doesn't have to be part of your process, but that could be. Personally, I like that rule. I like it when, dev, stage, production especially, you're not ever going in there and tweaking a view directly. You're doing that on local, making sure it works and going up through your QA process, right? Have everybody sign off on it before you pull it into production. And, you could probably get away with having that as a rule, right? If you make changes anywhere other than local, consider them temporary because they could disappear at any moment. And as long as everybody's on board with that, great. What config read-only does is basically blocks users from submitting config changes. So I actually already have the module downloaded. So I did a composer require. It's even enabled. It's enabled on my local. It's enabled everywhere. But even when it's enabled, there's still another step that you have to do. So we're going to get to that in a second. And here, I'll just throw it up here. So for the recording, config read only. So this is the module I'm talking about, configuration read only mode, but everyone calls it config read only. The machine name config _ read only, READONLY. All right, so what this module does, when it's enabled and activated, has to be activated. When it's activated in an environment, it makes it impossible to submit any page that saves config. You'll see in a minute, we'll get a little message up here saying the site's in config read only, and this button will be grayed out. So let's just do that real quick. And just to show you on my local, and I love this module. I try to get away with using this module with all my clients. Let me see, config. Yeah, there you go. Configuration read only, you can see it's selected there. But clearly on my local here, I can still submit config. So it's kind of a two-step process. So the way I do this in my settings.local, and I'm going to make this bigger because I know that's super small. Here's the way I like to do it. In my settings.local, which I always use on my local, I have config read only set to false. All right, so it's never enabled locally. In my settings.php, before you do the include for your settings.local, you can set it to true. So setting it up this way basically means anywhere where you're not using a settings.local, it's going to be read only, which means dev, stage, multi-dev, production. You can get a lot fancier with this. Pantheon has all kinds of environment variables. So you can say if on Pantheon and live environment, then set it true. But basically, this is the secret sauce to get this module working. So I'm going to make this change. Oops, what did I hit? Something I shouldn't have. All right, so I've made that change. Git add websites, default settings, git status, git commit-m, and this is going to be enabled config read only in remote env run this. Git push Pantheon master. All right, so let's watch that happen. Super exciting. Let me get some water. The Queen's Gambit as well. Another great show. I know everyone's talking about it, but
oh yeah, we all the nerds love that.
Oh my gosh, so good.
Chess and Booze, sweet.
What's the other one we just watched? Oh, Tehran on Apple TV Plus. It's kind of like if you like spies and stuff like that. That was pretty good too. Or Tehran. I'm not sure how to say capital of Iran. Okay, so that's been pushed. You know, and the module was already, you know, it's already enabled. It's enabled everywhere, but all we've done is we've just, you know, set it to true. So if I do a reload here, so we're on Pantheon, the form will not be saved because configuration active store is read only. So I can't, you know, I love this. Some people don't like it. You know, I wouldn't be able to create a content type if I wanted to. I can't edit an existing content type. If I come over here to manage fields, and if I want to edit this field, for example, I can see everything, but you can't save anything. So what does this do? This makes it so that it's just about impossible to accidentally delete someone else's configuration, right? This enforces process. You know, you know, anyone who's, well, you guys have all seen this, or anyone who's here last week, and this enforces this little arrow right here, right? It makes it so that you can't make any config changes here, which, you know, makes sense because even if you make a config change here, I don't want you pushing from a remote into, you know, from a remote environment into our repository. If you need to make a change, any change, you need to do it, you know, through the process. Do it on local, commit, push, have the right people sign off on it, pull it into your test environment, QA environment, whatever, have someone else sign off on it. Everything looks good, pull it into production, and you're done. I'd like to say I always want pulls into production to be non-events. I want to have practiced them 3 or 4 times so that, you know what, I'll pull into production at 4 o'clock on a Friday. I'll do it, right? Because if you can build the confidence that what you're doing is the right thing and it's going to work and it's been well tested, it shouldn't be an issue. So some downsides about this. You know, I see Albert's here. So Albert and I work on a site together where they are constantly messing with panels. And unfortunately, placement of blocks and placement of panes and panels is configuration. So that's kind of a content-y thing rather than a configuration thing, but it's actually stored in configuration. So there is a way in config read only to whitelist certain configurations so that you can, if you want, change a pane position. Yeah. So I know we have for that particular site, and Albert, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think we have whitelisted panels, meta tags. There's at least one other thing in there. I can't think of it, but those 2 for sure.
I'll take a look here real quick.
What's that?
So I'll take a look here.
Okay. Yeah. But once you remove those from configuration, you know, you're not, you know, what happens if you have to add a whole new page to page manager, right? You do that on your local, even if you export that and commit it, you're never going to be pulling it in anywhere. So you just have to, sometimes you might have to temporarily disable config read only in order to get, whitelisted config in when you actually want it in. So there's some hurdles there. There's another module. I'm not going to demo it. What's
looks
it?
like we have the menu, meta tags, and those page manager items.
Right. Menu. It's not menu items. It's like menu placement, right?
System.menu.main is what's in here.
Yeah. So menu links are content, but their position in a menu is configuration, which is a huge pain. So that's why we whitelisted that one. There's another one, config ignore. This one's kind of interesting. I'm not going to demo this one. I'm not, like my two favorite are clearly read only and split. And we're going to cover split. We're going to spend a lot of time with split here in a moment. Config ignore basically allows you to whitelist configuration YAML files only during config import. So it's kind of like read only, right? It makes it so that when you do a config import, you're not going to import certain configs. So depending on what your exact use case or process is, you might want this instead of read only. But so I thought I'd throw that out there. The downside about this is it's not ready for Drupal 9 yet. Split and read only are ready for Drupal 9. This one does not have a Drupal 9 compatible release yet. So buyer beware with that one. Okay, let me disable config read. Should I disable? Yeah, let me disable it just so it doesn't get in the way of what we're about to do. Okay, so any questions about read only? If you're a process person like I am, you probably like it. That's me. Oh, hey, John. I didn't see John there. John's one of my oldest Drupal friends, and you can interpret that either way.
Well, just look at my picture.
Actually, I think you can interpret it both ways. I think it'd be just almost accurate, right?
Yeah.
All right. So Brian has a question. Can you talk about the canonicalness or importance of the config YAML file? Should we typical treat config export file? Oh, yes. Short answer is yes. And it was just to me. So Brian, I'm gonna copy and paste your question to everybody so they can see it. Hopefully that's okay with you because I just did it. Yeah, absolutely. Config is code. After you do a config export, it's code. I mean, you saw what I did a few minutes ago. I did a git diff on it so I could see the changes. I treat it like code, and just like code, I commit early and often. I want smaller commits involving config. I don't want a commit involving 50 config files, because just like if you commit code that touches 50 files, that's a bear to figure out where things went wrong. So commit early and often with config and just make it manageable. That's in my opinion, that's what it's all about. All right, let's get to config split, shall we? All right, so config split, super, super useful. I can't think of a site where I don't use it. And basically what it lets you do is it lets you take all of that configuration and say, I want some of it to go in this directory instead of that directory, right, on export. So when you do a config export, you can split off some of your config into a different directory. And then on import, you can basically say, only take the config from this directory over here, but not that directory over there. That's the long and the short. So let's kind of set this up, and I kind of already have it set up, but let's go through it. You install this module. Oh, what happened? Install this module with Composer, just like any other module, and enable it with Drush. Nothing special. What did I click on? Something. Oh. And I will show you. And unfortunately, on this main page, it doesn't. There is one little thing that I'm going to show you. It's in the documentation, to be fair, but it's the one thing that makes config split super useful, and everybody should know about it. And it makes me crazy that it's not on this page. And one of these days, I might just take the time to do something about it. And I'll show you what that is. And those of you who use config split probably already know what I'm talking about. So here is a very typical example. On local, what's the module that you're probably using on local that you definitely aren't using anywhere else? We say it all together. What's that?
Devel.
Devel, there you go. Yeah. Devel, right? So I installed Devel, and I've enabled Devel and Devel Generate. Now, Devel and Devel Generate have no business being active on dev stage production, unless you're doing some weird stuff, right? But at this point in time, if we didn't know about config split, if I do a config export right now, part of the config I'm exporting is basically going to say, oh, well, Devel and Devel Generate are enabled. And you know what? Devel has a configuration page, and so does Devel Generate. So all of this configuration, all of these little checkboxes and whatnot, these are all saved to config. So that's all in my config YAML file. So when all that Devel stuff is in here. So when I config export, now it's in here. When I git add and commit, it's here. When I push, it's here. When I pull, it's here. When I import, suddenly Devel is enabled here. Well, the use case is then I want to split off all of that Devel configuration into another place, so that when I move all my config around, by the time we do this, I want to tell config import over here, ignore the config in this other place. Just import the config in the main place. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing we do is once you enable the module, you're going to get config split settings. And you can set up as many splits as you want. So I've just split up one, but you can imagine a scenario where you have multiple splits. I have a project where we have 3 splits. We have a local split. We have a dev split, which is for like the dev and QA environments. And then we have a production split. And think about it, in the production split, you can disable things like views UI and field UI. Like you can really get your site lean. If you're using like SendGrid or something, you might only want the SendGrid configuration on production. By splitting that off into a prod split, you won't accidentally, send emails to real users from dev. So there's a lot of cool things that you can do with these splits. So I created so what I did was earlier today, I hit this button and I created what I call a local split, which is exactly what you think it is. It's going to have all of our Devel stuff. So this is the form when you click to add a new one. I give it a name, local, machine name of local. I'll make this a little bit bigger for you. I like descriptions because Mike from today or Mike from 3 months from now doesn't necessarily always remember what Mike from today does or did. So descriptions help. The folder, this is a relative path. So I recommend, and actually I think, so it's recommended to be a sibling directory of what the main sync directory is. So what does that mean? And I know this is a little bit small over here, but just bear with me. So if you remember last time we set up our config directory, right? So this is the directory that holds all the main config. So I have a sibling directory called config split, and that's where I'm going to put all my splits. So inside there, I know, again, I apologize, it's tiny, but inside of the config split directory, I've got a directory with lowercase local, which matches the machine name. So you don't have to match the machine name, but consistency is good. So it's a relative path from the Drupal root. So up one directory, config split / local. So config related to this split is going to end up in here instead of in the main config directory. You can give weight to your splits. If you have multiple splits, you might want one split to go before another. if you want the split to always be active, I almost always uncheck this for all of my splits, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. And then you can define, well, what gets split out? And I don't know why this looks funny, but it does. That's weird. I don't know. Hopefully I didn't break anything. But basically, this makes it real easy. You can configure, configuration from which modules get split out. So we can even say like, views UI here. In this case, we'll just say devel and devel generate. So what will this do? This will basically split out two things. Number one, it will split out the fact that these modules are even enabled. So by having entire modules in a split, they will not be enabled unless this split is active. The second thing it does is any configuration related or defined, I should say, by either of these modules becomes part of this split. Now, let's say you have a module that you want to remain enabled everywhere, but you want some of the config that it defines to not be, or to be split out. You can put specific configuration items in here, right? So you can go per YAML file basically there if you wanted to. Additional configuration is helpful because you can do page manager dots. You can use wildcards down here. So that's handy down there. So this is basically a complete split, which means, if you have stuff defined in here, it will get split out no matter what. There's also a very similar section for conditional split, which basically means you're going to get, it's not going to take them out of the main config, but it's going to create a secondary copy in the split. That way, you can have configuration in the main config that gets overridden by what's in the split. I use this one sometimes, but really this, for me, the complete split is the workhorse. So that's the one we're going to focus on. You could think of a conditional split is good for things like I use it for like credentials, for like SMTP credentials, right? You could have, credentials that are used only on production, but then you have other credentials that are used everywhere else. So you don't want to completely disable the SMTP module. You just want to override the credentials of the base configuration when your split is active. All right, so when we do that, and then we go to our config sync page. Oh, here, let me show you one other thing, the important bit before we go there. So now let's go back into our, oh, here, I got it right down here. Settings.php. Nothing here related to config split, which basically means we're not going to have any of our split configurations enabled by default on all environments. But if we look at our local, our settings.local, we're basically saying enable the local split whenever settings.local is used. All right, so if you remember a second ago, let me go back here. This active checkbox is the same as this true or false. So by having it not checked or false, on all environments by default, our local split is false. Our local split is false, it's not being used. So when we push this stuff up to Pantheon, because there's nothing in here in the settings.php file that's going to enable that split is disabled. But when we're on our local and we are including settings.local, we are basically enabling this split on local with that line. So this is basically the secret, in my opinion, the secret sauce. Because think about it, you can then, if you have multiple splits, you can basically say, all right, well, on local, oops. I want the local split active, the dev split not active, and the live split not active. But everywhere else, well, maybe we do something like this, true. All right, so everywhere else we have dev active. And then I don't remember, I mean, I could dive into settings.pantheon, but there's some if statement, if, and I'll just say Pantheon live. So that's some environmental variable, let's say. So now you can do something like this, right? So by default, and here, let's just do this super complete for, it's a little bit duplicated code that we don't need, but it'll make it super clear, I think. By default, on all environments, local is disabled, dev is enabled, live is disabled. If we're on the Pantheon live environment, then the only one that's enabled is the live. If there's a settings.local and that gets included, then local is enabled and the other ones are not. So do not worry about setting this. Always set this disabled. Always don't, never check that. And the other thing I used to do, I think a lot of people used to do, is should we ignore the config of our split? Right? Because if we ignore the config of our split, then that never actually gets up to Pantheon, so then it can never be active that way. I think when config split first came out, that's what a lot of people did. But as soon as this type of switches or this type of switch was added, it just makes it easier to, this is a configuration page, all this. So when you save this goes into the database as config. When you do a config export, this goes into the main config directory. So the metadata about your split is everywhere. It's on all of your environments, but it's only active if you set it to active in your settings.php. So on our local, on the config sync page, if you're using config split, it will tell you which splits are you using, and that's a link to the configuration. So what does this mean? This means when you do a drush config import on your local, it's pulling from both config and config split local. When you do a drush config export, it's exporting to both places as well. So this should just be a change on my settings.php. So let's just do that. Git add websites default settings.php, git commit -m, config split stuff. We'll just do that. Git push Pantheon master. So while that's going up, I mean, keep in mind, inside of this config directory, there is a, if I can find it, there is. This is in the main config directory. This is our local split information. And it's basically, here are the two modules that we're splitting out, devel and devel generate. So this configuration, when we do a config import, this configuration is going to be imported into our dev environment in a moment. Let's wait for that to happen. All right. So if we come here, let's just be very methodical about this. We'll first go to extend. All right, the module's there. It's enabled. which is fine. It can be enabled everywhere. We go to config split settings. We see our local settings. They're there. But just because they're here doesn't mean they're in use. They are inactive. On local, they're active. Not sure why it says overwritten. They're active, because we have this. On our Pantheon remote, they are inactive because we're not using a settings.local on Pantheon remote. And it's definitely false there. And I pushed up some dummy code, but oh well. So if we go to our synchronize page, we are not using any config split configuration. And it'd be really helpful, I would say, if it said in this environment to really hammer the point home, because we're clearly using it in our local environment, but it's disabled here. So what does that mean? Well, come on, finish loading. There we go. It means devel and devel generate are not enabled. It means there are no devel menu items here. And it means that even though we have configuration differences between our local and dev, our config is still in sync because, and I know this is small, but all of the configuration related to devel and devel generate is all in our split off directory. And that's it. There's no special drush commands. If the split is active, when you do a drush config import, it will be used. If the split is not active, it will not be used. Back in the old days, when config split first came out, there was the right hooks weren't in the configuration system, so there were different commands. It was like CS import and CS export, I think, something like that. Or CSIM. Yeah, config split import and config split export. But that you don't have to worry about that. Just use the same commands that we've been using the whole time, and they just work. So there's some questions here. Okay, so Brian, does this signify the official death knell for default versus other config folders with the monolith settings.php files there? Well, possibly, if that's the way you're doing things, you could, probably do things this way. And I mean, I think what you're going to end up with, and I know I have it on some sites, is your settings.php is basically just going to have some logic involved here for which split is enabled when. Would configure only prevent you from enabling devel via checkbox? Yes, absolutely, Matt. So if you guys want to, I think we talked about this a little bit last time, but on this extend page, these are all configuration changes. And they actually get, when you do a config export, it's this cord extension file. Right? So when you enable devel, well, in this case, well, let's just pretend, when you enable devel, you'll get, something like that. And basically 0 is not whether it's enabled or not. This is just the module weight. But if devel is in this file, then that module is enabled. Yep. Any other questions? What's the #1 rule of Fight Club? Talk about the configuration system. You have to define the process before you even think about implementing
about Fight Club.
Exactly. Yeah. Before you implement any of these, you have to define the process. This is a process-oriented thing. I'm lucky enough. I live, right down the street from Kennedy Space Center, So I've got a bunch of friends who work up there, and NASA especially, you know, contractors as well, but especially the folks who work for NASA, they are process people. You watch any movie about astronauts and, you know, up in spacecraft, before they hit any button, what do? They're looking at the freaking binder with like their steps. You know, those are people, you know, those are just processes that have been written out and tested. And so this is a very similar thing. This is all about process. So define the process in human terms for how you want to do this. You know, developers should not be allowed to change X, right? Or site, you know, content authors should not be allowed to change this, or site stakeholders. Define all those things. Define the process for, if you want to tweak a view, what's the process for that? Is the process, I want to be able to go into production and tweak this view? Okay, that's fine. If that's a necessary thing that your organization needs to do, they need to be able to tweak views on production, then that doesn't mean you don't use a configuration system. That basically just means that every time a view is tweaked, there has to be a process to get that configuration into Git as soon as possible. So that's why this all starts with defining what the process is, defining who needs to do what when. And then you use these tools to manage all of it and to get your configuration into Git. Michael's asking me, is there a similar workflow process for doing this in WordPress? I don't think so. I'm not a WordPress expert by any stretch, but I do not believe they have any type of a cohesive configuration system. WordPress core might, I'd have to look, but I can tell you modules, plugins, I'm sorry, it's kind of the Wild West with how they store their config. So I think you would need someone who is much more savvy at WordPress than me to talk about that. Look at that, 4 o'clock, top of the hour. I hit the post. I'm like a DJ.
Yes. I wanted to tell everybody that we're having a holiday thing, holiday Zoom, December 18th, 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 Pacific. If everybody can make it, we'd love that. Matthew's going to send out invites to everybody. Jackbox, you know, pretty much after party of Drupal Camp type of deal. So should be fun. Hope to see you guys there.
All right. Unless there's any other questions, I think we're all set, right?
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Hopefully I answered. So Matt, I know you were asking about using this with a big update, right? A big like Drupal 9 update type thing. So I've never done it, but I could imagine you set up like an update split.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost think you're going to want to, like, I'm vacillating here in my mind. Do you want to just split everything? Or maybe you want to do that conditional split and split everything that's changed. Because I think it's going to be very difficult unless you practice a few times and know what config changes from 8 to 9.
Yeah, it's not 8 to 9. It's just from 8.9.6 to 8.9.11 or whatever the latest one is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if it's just that, I don't even know if I'd bother with the config system.
Yeah.
I would probably just, well, would I? Gotta have to think about that. I've never thought about it. So
the only thing about it, and I don't really know if I can really get into it now, but the only thing about it is that
you're gonna throw a curveball right now, aren't you?
After I run this update, there's also something else going on where the previous developer broke something that is preventing the database patches from being applied.
Oh, okay.
So in order to fix that, I have to apply a composer patch, and I need to drop some tables manually that are empty tables, so I'm not too scared about it.
Oh.
But once I do all that stuff and then run the update, it runs. But then I can't import the old config because the schemas are all different and crazy shit has happened. So, you know, that's why I was thinking I might want to try to split it out. But honestly, I'm just going to postpone that, do whatever I can with 896 to get the business requirements met for this client, and then try to update it, like, you know, as soon as I get it some kind of stable state, or maybe update it.
This sounds like the classic case where I would recommend biting the bullet and talking to your client about fixing the root cause of all this.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I get it. I understand where you're at, and I have a client right now, you know, who they brought me on because their site becomes unresponsive once a day, and they're not sure why. So we've been doing, like, you know, and it's not reproducible.
Yeah.
So it's like, so they're like, well, can we try updating this module? Well, I'm like, okay, you can, but you could just be wasting time. I said, in the long run, you're going to want to fix the core. You're going to want to figure out what the core issue is. Like, you're going to want to do the hard work.
Yeah.
Or find someone, and that's what they did. They found me to help them do that hard work of, because if you can solve the problem at the source, I use the analogy of, like, if you have mold in your house, right? You don't want to just cover up the mold.
Right. You need
to get rid of the mold. So you need to get rid of the mold of your Drupal site, solve the problem so that moving forward, you're kind of on a stable.
Yeah, here's the problem with my situation that I really just discovered this week. Since they don't have like different environments that are live and dev and staging or testing or whatever, you know, they don't have any of that. They only have one thing, and the previous developer already corrupted the database in a way that prevents the database patches from being applied, and I can't even find an earlier database backup. They're of the opinion that, like, you can always restore it from an earlier backup, but that's not really the case, because a lot of the content and config that came after that is going to be, I'm going to need to rebuild, you know, or maybe I would need to just do a clean install of Drupal 8 and actually migrate from Drupal 8 to Drupal 8. It might be, and that's in the scope of what they will pay for. So we're going to have a conversation.
Yeah.
You might be able to
who's going to DrupalCon Europe next week? Yeah. Or who's attending virtually? Anybody other than me? All right. Well, I was going to say, hope to see you there, but oh well. All right. I'll stop talking now. I got to go home and watch The Mandalorian before dinner tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you, man.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.